So anyway, what I started to say was, you know, we call ourselves the Sunshine State. That's very misleading. Although on a day like this, you know, it's appealing. But actually, other states get more sun than we do. And in fact, many of our cities actually get more rain than Seattle does. As with many things in Florida, calling ourselves the Sunshine State is a little misleading. I think instead of, you know, a lot of people would probably say, oh, we should call ourselves the Punchline State because there's so many jokes about it. But I think the correct title is we should call ourselves the Most Interesting State because I think we can defend that. So let me tell you about my new book by telling you a little bit about one of my older books. All right, let's see if this works. No?
Try it one more time. I think
Okay. This time I'll think really hard about it.
Yeah.
You know, like on the Music Man. I used to think that. Can you just advance it if I give you the high sign? Yeah, there we go. So, in 2013, I did a 1-month blog for Slate about Florida. And of course, the big problem was I had more entries than would last for a month. I mean, I had enough for like a year and a half. Towards the end, the editor said, wow, this has been really fun. You should think about turning this into a book. And then around then, I got a call from an agent in New York who said, we think 2016, the year of the presidential election, would be a great time for a book about Florida because, of course, every 4 years, the rest of the country gives Florida the side eye and says, how are you guys going to screw it up this time? So I wrote a proposal. He sent it around to various New York publishers, and I think 16 of them said, no way, nobody wants to read about Florida. What a dull subject. And then one, thank God, said yes and put it out, and out came Oh Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country. And next, you can go ahead. Yeah, and got rave reviews in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. It actually made the New York Times bestseller list for all of a week, which was enough so that they could slap that title on the paperback version. New York Times bestseller. And even better, I won a Florida Book Awards gold medal, which I actually wore around my neck like a rap star for about a week. So as I went around the state promoting the book, 2 things happened. One was people came up and told me their Florida stories, which was great. It was great, and some I can't repeat, but some I can. My favorite one was probably the couple who said they had accidentally found out that their next door neighbor was running an illegal nudist bed and breakfast. And the way they found out is they gave their kids a trampoline for Christmas. Like in Florida. But the other thing happened is people said, we want a sequel. When are you going to write a sequel? We want a sequel. I was like, I just put this one out. No, you need to write a sequel right now. This is great, but we want more. We want another Oh Florida. We want, you know, Oh Florida 2 Electric Boogaloo or something like that. And do the next thing. And so I said, well, I feel like I said everything I needed to say with this one. There was a chapter on what it's like to grow up in Florida. There's a chapter about, gambling in Florida. There's a chapter about driving in Florida. No, those are not the same chapter. And so I went off, and instead I wrote a book I've been wanting to write for about 25 years called Cattail, The Wild Weird Battle Saved the Florida Panther, which came out right before the pandemic hit, and which kind of ruined a lot of public appearance plans that I had. But a lot of people told me they really liked reading it during the pandemic because it had a kind of a hopeful ending to it about the Florida Panther. But the whole time I was thinking, how can I do a sequel? People really want a sequel. Maybe there's a way to do it. So what I came up with was this idea for what I think of as the Son of O Florida, which is the new book, The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Wildlife. Go on. Yeah, there we go. It's not a direct sequel to Florida. It doesn't have the same chapter lineup or anything like that. It's not structured the same. And it's shorter, which, that's a good thing, right? But what it is, it's a collection of stories and columns that I've written over the last 30 years that sort of have that same goal that O Florida had, which was to celebrate Florida's glorious weirdness. You know, in some cases, those of us who've been here all this time sort of live with it, and we accept it. We don't think it's anything unusual. We just assume, oh yeah, every state has mermaids, right? You know, but no, only Florida. And so, yeah, and so the whole point is to sort of continue the spirit of O Florida, and to tell people a little bit more about their history and culture, but in the meantime, make them laugh a little bit and make them think too. And so it's set up to have 51 chapters. If I'd been smart, there would have been 52, and you could read one a week for a whole year. Some are short, some are long, and they're divided into 4 sections. But first, a word about that wonderful cover. A guy named Andy Marlette, who is the editorial cartoonist for the Pensacola News Journal, my hometown paper. When I came to Pensacola to do a talk about O Florida, he drew this caricature of me for the paper. And so we were discussing, when I was discussing with the publisher about this book, I said, hey, maybe we can get Andy to adapt that cartoon. And they said, what a great idea. Andy's dad, you may have heard of, Doug Marlette. He used to draw the kudzu comic strip in the papers. And Andy himself has a comic strip he's starting called Shrimp and Grits, which always makes me hungry when I talk about it. So excuse me if I drool a little bit. But I think Andy really sort of captured the spirit of the book there. And honestly, I told him I think that'll sell more books than the actual book itself. I just wish he had a handsomer cover model. That's my point. So the first chapter is called Florida Men and Florida Women. So let me tell you about some of the Florida men who are featured in this section. The first one is this gentleman, Ron Bergeron. He is a rodeo champion, a developer, a rancher, a big landowner in Hardee County. And so one day he was showing some visitors around his Hardee County ranch, and he saw an alligator in a pond, and he thought, well, I'll just wrestle the alligator and put on a show for people, you know, like you do. And so Ron jumped on the back of the alligator and began wrestling it, and the alligator didn't want to cooperate. I guess he was feeling shy, so he bit Ron's hand and took him to the bottom of the pond and started the death roll. And Ron, fortunately, quick-thinking guy, knew what to do. He punched the alligator in the nose until it let go. And then he climbed out of the pond and said, ta-da! And his friends looked at him and looked at his fingers and said, Ron, you need to go to the ER. I mean, that was impressive, but you need treatment and help. And so he went, and the ER doc said, yeah, it's kind of mangled your fingers there. And the interesting thing to me was that Ron had technically committed a crime by doing this, because in Florida, what he had done is what's called molesting an alligator. So it's a protected species. And so the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission sent an investigator out to talk to him about this. And the investigator, you know, Ron told him the whole thing, didn't lie, was very upfront about it, showed him his fingers, showed him the x-rays of his fingers. And the investigator wrote it all up and handed it into the prosecutor's office in Hardee County. And they said, this is about Ron Bergeron, right? Yeah. The really rich guy that lives down the road? Yeah. Yeah, we're not prosecuting him. And so shortly after that, Ron was appointed to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Thus, I believe, making him the only Florida politician to be appointed to help lead the agency that investigated him for committing a crime. But he now calls himself Alligator Ron Bergeron. And if you call his office in Davie and get put on hold, the hold music is by Tanya Tucker, who he claims is a personal friend, singing a song called The Ballad of Alligator Ron. All right, and then I wrote about Ben Henry Pooley, who was an official in Santa Rosa County back in the 1980s. Ben Henry had been hired on a 3-2 boat and fired on a 3-2 boat, hired back on a 3-2 boat, fired on a 3-2 boat. And then Ben Henry said, maybe I need to try a different profession. And so he got a job as a radio commentator on the local radio station there in Milton. And he became sort of a rural Rush Limbaugh. He had funny nicknames for different politicians there in Santa Rosa County. He knew where all the bodies were buried, so he could tell stories. And people all over Santa Rosa County tuned in when his show was on because they were fascinated and they were amused. Some people were not happy because somebody then set off a bomb in Ben Henry's trailer. Fortunately for Ben Henry, the bomb was on the other side of a coat closet from where Ben Henry was asleep, so it didn't cause him any harm, a little ringing in his ears. And so people said, Ben Henry, maybe you need to tone it down. No, this means I'm getting to people. So he kept going. Well, so did the attempts on his life. There were 4 total attempts to kill Ben Henry. The most famous of which was the one where one of his enemies had hired a hitman to take him out. Well, of course, if you've lived in Florida a while, you know the general rule is 9 times out of 10, if you hire a hitman, it's actually an undercover cop. This was an undercover cop. It was a Florida Department of Law Enforcement agent who had promised to kill Ben Henry in exchange for $10,000. And so one day, Ben Henry had no idea this was going on. One day, all these FDLE agents swooped down on him, took him out in the woods, laid him on the ground, smeared ketchup in his hair, and took a Polaroid of him to show to the person who hired the hitman. And they also took his pinky ring because he was just that kind of boss hog character who wore a pinky ring. And so they went to inform the client, who, as it turned out, was a former county commissioner who was running to try and get back into office. And they arrested him. And he kept telling them, no, that money you found under my car seat, those were campaign contributions. That was not me trying to buy Ben Henry's murder. Well, so Ben Henry survived all of that, and in fact boasted that he had never had any trouble getting life insurance because nobody could kill him. But what I love is that people refer to this as the Ketchup Murderer, even though no murder actually occurred. But the ketchup did, and I always wondered why the Heinz people didn't hire him to endorse that product. And I wrote about Wilbur Snap, who played the organ for the Clearwater Phillies minor league games and also for the Philadelphia Phillies when they were there for spring training. One night at a Clearwater Phillies game, there was a close play at the plate. The 22-year-old umpire called it against the hometown team, and Wilbur expressed his opinion by playing 3 blind mice. And the umpire pointed at him and did this, making him the very first ballpark organist in the U.S., and probably anywhere, to get ejected because of his song choice. This was before the internet, so you can't really say Wilbur went viral, but he went about as close to viral as you could get in those days. He got on the Today Show, written up in papers all over the country. And even the day I was hanging out with him at the ballpark, was like 15 years later, people were still coming up to get his autograph. Hey, are you the guy that got thrown out of the ballpark? I guess you could say his work hit a chord. Thank you. Now, some of the Florida women I wrote about were all very interesting. I wrote about how Florida has a mermaid industry. Go ahead. A mermaid industry here in Florida. Some of them are state employees. You guys, are you familiar with Weeki Wachee Springs? Have you been to Weeki Wachee Springs? Okay. Weeki Wachee, in 1947, this guy named Newton Perry bought the spring, cleaned all the old refrigerators and stuff out of it, built an underwater amphitheater, hid air hoses around inside the spring, and then hired women to pull out 60-pound prosthetic tails and swim around away with the tourists. And it became a big hit. Elvis came by, a bunch of celebrities, but by 2000, business had sort of tailed off. And so rather than see this thing go to a developer or a water bottler, the state stepped in and bought it and made it part of the state park system, which is why we now have mermaids as state employees in Florida, and has led to some interesting discussions about the use of taxpayer dollars to pay for waterproof lipstick and shell bras. But Weeki Wachee Springs has been sort of the seed for a whole flowering of mermaids, I guess you could say that, all over the state. I've talked to mermaids up in Pensacola, over in Jacksonville, down in Fort Lauderdale. My favorite one, I think, was the lady in the red there who said, I'm 47, thank God water lifts. I also talked to and wrote about the most tattooed woman alive. I always hasten to add that last word. I think it's an important distinction. And how she made the Guinness Book of World Records, but more importantly, she fell in love, and her love story began in a tattoo parlor, which I think is wonderful. The man she fell in love with is also very tattooed. He's also in the Guinness Book, but neither of them has the same tattoo. They're each unique individuals, which I think is very charming. And I wrote about these 2 women who live in St. Petersburg. Hang on. It's coming. There it is. During the week, they run a dog grooming salon in St. Petersburg, and then on the weekends, they grab their camper and head down to the Everglades and hunt pythons. Just a fun thing to do. I wrote along with them so I could see how they do this. One of them drives their SUV along at about 6 miles an hour on this bloody road at midnight, and the other one stands up on the seats and sticks her head up out of the sunroof. They've got this enormous light array on top of the SUV to turn the area ahead of them into daylight, and they watch for snakes crossing the road. And if they see one, they yell, you know, snake or python, and they stop the car and dive out, and one grabs the head, and the other one grabs the body, and then they basically wrestle it for 45 minutes while it pees and poops on them. And they call that the sweet smell of success, because if you smell like that, you got one, you captured one. They do this not for the money, because there really isn't much money in it. I mean, if you don't get any pythons one night, it's basically minimum wage you pay. They do it because they feel like it's a good thing for the Everglades to take out these invasive species that aren't supposed to be here, but are basically wiping out every small mammal you can think of out there, raccoons, foxes, etc. But also because it's such a rush to do it. One of them said, you know, when we get old, that's when we'll go sit on a cruise ship. But for now, this is what we want to do. All right, and then next, there's a section called Crime Does Not Pay Enough. I spent 4 years covering criminal courts in Pinellas County. It was like getting tickets to all the best Broadway shows. You know, not the musicals, but you know, the comedies and the tragedies both. One of the pieces I wrote about is this gentleman, Joe Boujon, probably the wildest con man I ever wrote about. Joe's long list of victims included a judge. He persuaded this judge to marry him and his girlfriend to perform the marriage ceremony. And there were some things that Joe didn't tell the judge. One was that he was a fugitive from justice at the time. There was a bail bondsman who was tracking him down because there was a warrant out for his arrest. The second thing he didn't tell him was that the check he used to pay the judge not only was not drawn on a real account, it was drawn as in Joe drew it. And the third thing he didn't tell the judge is that he was still married to somebody else, so this was bigamy that he was committing. There's a story in there about twins, a set of identical twins who constantly get the court system messed up. You know, they arrest one, oh, I didn't do it, it was my brother. And then they arrest the other guy, oh, no, it wasn't me, it was the other guy. And then I wrote about the Sarasota educator whose letter to the U.S. Department of Justice is what prompted the FBI to investigate the musical hit Louie Louie, which supposedly had utterly filthy lyrics when it came out in 1962. This educator, we don't know his name, unfortunately, it's been redacted from the FBI files, but the files themselves are available on the internet if you want to read them. His daughter had brought home a 45 of Louie Louie by the Kingsmen and listened to it, and he thought it was the filthiest thing he'd ever heard, and he somehow got hold of the lyrics, the supposed lyrics to this song. And so when an FBI agent from Tampa came out to interview him about it, he gave him the lyrics, and the FBI agent dutifully mailed those to J. Edgar Hoover. So a Florida man sent J. Edgar Hoover dirty song lyrics. Not to spoil the story for you, but the FBI investigated for 2 months and finally decided it was unintelligible at any speed. And then there's a section called Wild Wildlife, where I wrote about some of the more unusual animal stories that we've got going on here in Florida. And this one is absolutely my favorite. Go ahead. The two guys in this picture, they're scientists, and they had heard stories of this apparently mythical panhandle creature called the leopard eel. People swore it existed, you know, sort of like the skunk ape, but nobody had seen it in such a way that they could prove that it existed. But supposedly this long, skinny thing that had little paddles on it and wings attached to his head, sort of like Captain America's helmet. Well, they were out looking for something completely different near Eglin Air Force Base in Panhandle and found one. They found a real leopard eel, and they decided to do what you have to do in order to describe it scientifically. They spent their own money on this, they spent their own time on it, and ultimately concluded it was not an eel at all. It's a type of salamander called a siren. So they named it the reticulated siren, and that those wings on its head are actually external gills, so it can breathe underwater. You know, their accomplishment in finding this thing was written up all over the place, and one of them said, you know, this shows you that we think we know what's going on in the natural world, but there's lots of stuff about it we don't know, things that we haven't discovered yet. We just need to look for them. Here's the thing I love about the story, though, is after it ran, I got a very stern letter from a New York attorney representing Tupperware. because the scientist had said, when I found it, I put it in a bucket and then I took it home and put it in a Tupperware container. And the attorney said, we want to make sure it really was Tupperware and not some other brand of plastic storage container, because we very jealously safeguard our trademark. And I wrote back and said, I completely understand. I know that Tupperware is a Florida product. In fact, there's a Tupperware museum in Kissimmee where you can go in and I guess burp all the historic Tupperware. You know, I would never cast aspersions on a Florida product. I love everything about Florida. And so yes, he said Tupperware, and this was a Tupperware container. It was not some other kind. P.S. Have your clients considered getting him to endorse your product? I think that would be a great idea. I think he could tell his fellow scientists, if you capture a mythical creature, put it in Tupperware. That's the best way to ensure it won't run away. For some reason, they have not taken me up on that. I wrote about the iguanas down in South Florida that repeatedly pop up in people's toilets as well as fall out of trees. Whenever there's a cold snap, like we just had a couple of weeks ago, the iguanas just fall out of the trees because they're cold-blooded. You know, they kind of freeze up, so to speak. But more often they pop up in people's toilets. They get up on the roof and come down through the plumbing, and then 3 a.m. you go to use the bathroom and and one plumber in Hollywood, Florida says he actually gets 10 calls a month about this. My favorite story about, well, two things. One is Sanibel had problems with iguanas before most everywhere else, and so their solution was to tax themselves so they could hire a trapper to come in and try and trap the iguanas. They are the only city in America with an iguana tax. The trapper, by the way, used his notoriety to write a cookbook called Save Florida, Eat an Iguana. But my favorite story about the iguanas, there was a guy in Key Biscayne who was driving home. It was on a cold day, and he turns a corner and he sees 40 of these iguanas, you know, stunned and laying out, stretched out on the ground. And he goes, barbecue. And so he pulls over and sort of, you know, gathers them up in his arms like they're firewood and puts them in his car and heads for home. He did not think this all the way through because they had the heater on in his car. And the iguanas revived and started running around inside the car, and the car went off the road. Anyway, he's okay, but no barbecue. And then I wrote about the monkeys that for decades have been running wild in Silver Spring State Park. Florida actually has 3 monkey populations. One is the vervet monkeys in Dania Beach, who escaped from a monkey breeding facility in the 40s. They're building them a shelter now. The second one is on Monkey Island in Homosassa, which was, you know, set up as a sort of attraction. And then the third one, and this is the biggest one, the one in Silver Spring, which the way they got there in the 1930s and 30s, a jungle cruise captain, I guess you'd say, decided the way to spice up his tour of the Silver River was to put monkeys on an island so that they'd come around a bend in the river and voila, there'd be monkeys on the island. So he got, I think, 6 or 7 of these rhesus macaques and turned them loose. There was one thing that he did not know, which was rhesus macaques can swim. So they did not stay on the island. They spread out through the park. There's about 100 of them now. Do you remember seeing the stories about the mystery monkey of Tampa Bay that ran around in the early 2000s? That was one of the Silver Springs monkeys. It had been, for some reason, shunned by the other monkeys and came over to Tampa, became a big celebrity, and got its own Twitter account and everything. Go ahead. I wrote about some, you know, it's not all fun and games. I wrote about some historic events. For instance, I wrote an obituary for Snooty the manatee, the longest lived captive sea cow. Lived in the Bishop Planetarium in South Florida Museum in Bradenton, where it was sort of the unofficial mascot of Manatee County. And it had been there for so long, it was brought there as a baby. It was actually born in captivity in Miami. And the keepers of Baby, as it was known then, and its mother, Lady, taught them tricks. You know, this is like, you know, this is from the 40s, back when Harry Truman was president. Snooty still knew how to do those tricks at age 69, you know, pulling itself out of the water when prompted, or doing a barrel roll when prompted. Unfortunately, there was a malfunction where somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do, and Snooty died at age 69. So it's a very sad story. But you know, Snooty, for decades, taught people what manatees look like and sort of charmed lots and lots of children. And there's such a big outpouring of sympathy. Somebody actually suggested when they tore down the Confederate monument in Bradenton, they should put up one for Snooty instead, because Snooty brought people together. I wrote a frontline report from the first bear hunt Florida had in 21 years. We had a series of people being attacked by bears, generally while they were around their trash cans, because that's what the bears were after. Bears would much prefer to eat saw palmetto berries, but the state had allowed people to harvest the berries for sale because they were considered an aphrodisiac in other countries. So because they didn't have enough berries, they were going after trash cans, and then they went going after people. One of the women who was attacked actually said, "I know who's responsible for this, it's my neighbor," and she pointed him out. And it turned out this guy was claiming to be the bear whisperer, and he wanted to be on TV, and he was putting food out for the bears so they would come eat. And she said, "That's why the bears are coming around here." Anyway, the State Wildlife Commission thought it would be a great idea if they had a bear hunt for the first time in 21 years. And they set a quota. They said there's going to be, I think it was 333 bears. That would be the max that would be killed over the course of this 1 week season. And it worked so well, they had to shut the season down for 2 days because they had already killed that many bears. And some of the bears they killed were mama bears that were still nursing their young. And there was a huge public relations disaster for the state. And that's why they have not had a bear hunt ever since then. And then I wrote about a visit to Perdido Key, one of the barrier islands that I sort of grew up playing on, a beach that I grew up playing on, to wait for and take one last look at these pristine white sands before the oil from the BP oil spill washed ashore. There are some life and death stories in there too. There's a piece in there about the Arcadia Rodeo. I talked to a guy whose job every night he goes out and pretends to be a bad guy, and he and his gang go out, you know, whooping and hollering and shooting up the place and rob the bank, and then the sheriff and his deputies ride in and gun him down, and so he dies every night of the rodeo. But I use that as sort of a framework to talk about what Arcadia was like 100 years before, and that it really was a sort of a Wild West place. There was a range war going on, there was lots of shooting and killing, and the famous Western artist Frederick Remington actually came to Arcadia in 1895 to write about the cowboys. You know, this is the guy who built his career on writing about the cowboys and the Western life from several decades before. Well, you know, that all kind of settled down. They had closed their open range. Florida was still an open range state until the 40s. So we were definitely still had cowboys. So he came here, he was not impressed. Mr. Remington did not think much of Florida cowboys, partly because we did not have shootouts in the main street. Instead, they ambushed each other in the swamp. And he referred to the cowboys as low-browed cowfolk who shoot and stab each other over cattle that are not fit for a pointer dog to mess on. So I'm pinpointing Frederick Remington as the start of the whole Florida man stereotype. Now I mentioned about covering courts. I wrote about a profile of the guy who had been on death row the longest from Pinellas County. And you know, he had been sentenced there when he was in his 20s, he was now in his 40s. He had become sort of a different guy, much more contemplative, much more attuned to things. And the son of his victim said, "I'm glad he didn't get executed quickly. I'm glad he's been on there for so long, because I hope every day he thinks about what he did and why he is there." And I wrote sort of the flip side of that. I wrote about a woman who, her father was killed. He was a cemetery employee, he's a deaf mute, and two of his co-workers killed him for the money in his pockets, about $35. And back then, the way the law was set up, you could be sentenced to life with a possibility of parole after 25 years. So when the 25 years came up, somebody from the state attorney's office said, "Hey, do you want to go, you know, talk to the parole board about this?" And she said, "Yeah." So she started going. Every time these guys were up for parole, she would go to the parole board and talk to them and keep them inside. And it sort of had taken over her life, where, you know, it had taken over her marriage and her job and everything. She was all about that. And she was training her son to take her place should that ever happen, need to happen. Now, the last section is called The State You're In, and the first piece in there talks about some of the funny names of places we have here in Florida, some of which I think sound like euphemisms for your naughty bits. So, you know, that's why I say don't Oklahoma Wahedge. That would be painful. Then I wrote a piece about Interstate 4 and how it's supposedly haunted. Did you guys know that? You know, I-4 is supposed to be haunted. There was a family of German immigrants in Sanford, or what became Sanford, in the 1800s, and they died of yellow fever before the priest could get to them and give them their last rites. So supposedly their spirits now haunt that area. Well, the DOT came in and just paved right over where they're buried. And so now they haunt the motorists and, you know, make sure their calls drop and their cars sputter and they run into each other. My question is, why are they bothering the motorists? We didn't cause the problems. Haunt the DOT. That's who paved over the cemetery. And then I wrote about, this is, I think, a really lovely story. There's a lot of the springs in Florida are owned by the state, except for this one particular one beautiful spring, which was owned by this woman who had been the secretary for a very powerful and influential man in St. Petersburg. He had had a secret affair with her and had promised 4 times to marry her and 4 times had backed out at the last minute. But before one of those marriages that didn't happen, he gave her the deed to this spring as a token of his love. And so when he died, he made her the executor of his estate. So suddenly this, you know, secretary is suddenly one of the more influential people in the state that controls all this land. And she made sure that the best properties went to the state. So like Wheaton Island in St. Petersburg, that was one that she made sure this important ecological and archaeological place became state property. But she hung on to the spring. That spring was hers. She wanted her and her family to keep it and to take care of it for as long as they could. And all throughout the book, other Florida writers get shouts, because really this book is sort of about Florida stories and Florida storytellers. So, for instance, there's a piece in there about John D. McDonald, who lived in Sarasota and wrote lots of great mysteries, including the famous Travis McGee mysteries. In the story, I tell about how a lot of people in my family love to read murder mysteries. My grandfather worshipped at the altar of Perry Mason, both the books and the TV show. My mom was a big fan of Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple. I started off with Encyclopedia Brown and then graduated to Sherlock Holmes and you know, Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe. And then one day when I was 14, my great aunt cornered me and took a big drag on her Pall Mall and said, "I think you're ready for Travis McGee now," and handed me this paperback that had this scantily clad woman on the cover. And I said, you know, 14, I'm looking at the cover and go, "Yes, ma'am, I think you're right. I think I'm ready for that." But what I wasn't prepared for was 2 things. One was that, you know, all the mysteries I'd been reading were set in places like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, where you might expect there to be crime, but these were stories that were set in Florida, and it was my first introduction to the idea that this is a sunny place for shady people here. And the other thing was, you know, he split in these subtle environmental comments throughout the books, and you know, it didn't occur to me that these places that I had seen and fell in love with while I was camping and canoeing with my Boy Scout troop or hunting with my dad were places that might someday be paved over just because people valued money over nature. So those were 2 important things I took away from reading his stuff. And he was an environmental activist in real life. He was before anybody even knew about environmental activism, he was trying to stop dredging in Sarasota Bay and stop condos from being built on barrier islands and so forth. And in one particular instance, he had created an organization called Save Our Bays, or SOBs. And that was in a book called A Flash of Green, which is now acknowledged the earliest environmental novel written in the United States. Came out the same year as Silent Spring. And subsequently, there was a fight over a dredging project, and people actually created an organization called Save Our Bays, or SOBs, to fight it. So, you know, life imitating art. I wrote a piece about Elmore Leonard, who's generally more associated with Detroit, because that's where he was from, but he lived part-time in Florida, and all the books that really made his name are books that are set at least partly or fully in Florida, including the ones about Raylan Givens, the marshal, who is the star of the TV show Justified. He did a tremendous amount of research. He adapted a lot of real-life stuff into his books, to the point where a lawyer in Fort Lauderdale told the paper there that he thought Elmore Leonard followed his clients home and got them to talk to him for his research. In many of his books, there are characters who are members of the Crow family, like Dale Crow Jr. and so forth, who are, they're not as smart as they think they are, and they're constantly getting in trouble. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like Frederick Remington's invention, the Florida man, has found a modern counterpart. And then I wrote about Donald J. Sobel, the most popular author you've never heard of. He wrote the Encyclopedia Brown books for kids, never posed for a picture, never gave a TV interview. He didn't want his name to be the big name. He wanted people to focus on his character of Encyclopedia Brown, and he didn't really talk to adult groups. He would go talk to school groups because those were his buyers, those were his consumers, people who got excited about his books. And bear in mind, he was doing all this research before the internet. You know, this is all these arcane little facts he used. Those were things that he had encountered doing his own research. And then I wrote a piece about Charles Williford, who's known to be the godfather of the wacky crime novel. You guys, have you ever heard of him? Yeah, he's kind of unknown today, but he wrote this great book called Miami Blues that came out in the 80s and then was followed by 3 sequels, and they're just hysterically funny. One of the books that he wrote, one of the sequels, is called Sideswipe, and one of his readers didn't like it much and put it in a box and sent it back to him with a card that said, "It should be a crime to charge this much money for crap like this." And the book had 6 bullet holes in it. And when Williford told his friends about this, they were horrified. They said, "Did you call the cops? Did you report this to the FBI? What's going on?" He said, "No, it's good to get feedback." So I hope I get some good feedback from my book, but not that kind. Let me mention some other wild Florida tales that I brought up. Cattail, the wild weird battle to save the Florida panther, which Garden and Gun magazine declared to be one of the 20 best books of 2020. And then The Scent of Scandal, Greed, Betrayal, and the World's Most Beautiful Orchid, which is about how Selby Gardens in Sarasota went up facing criminal charges of wildlife trafficking, all because of this beautiful orchid that someone smuggled in from Peru. And I always like to mention, when I bring up Scent of Scandal, that it is, as far as I know, the only book ever classified as true crime / gardening. I always feel bad for the library clerks trying to figure out what shelf that is. So, do you guys have any questions for me?
What's next?
I am working on a book proposal about pythons. I think that's a fascinating subject, and I think not just because, of course, it's a major environmental problem, but because it has become such an ongoing issue that it's become part of the image of Florida, that we are the state that has pythons, you know. And the other interesting thing about it is, you know, here they're considered to be a major problem. We actually pay people to go out and kill them, and they don't seem to ever, the numbers never seem to go down, they just keep going up. In their home habitat in Southeast Asia, they're an endangered species. So they're actually doing better here than they were at home. So should we be killing them? I don't know. So I think that's an interesting subject. And my tentative title for it is The Snake That Swallowed Florida. So yes.
Craig, these stories, they're great.
Thank you.
And
I've never met before.
and they all require a great deal of reporting and research, as well as time writing and crafting. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you enjoy both parts. But is there one part?
No, writing is painful. It's painful. It's like, you know, occasionally you'll turn a phrase and go, "Oh, that'll work." And then of course that's the one you end up having to cut out. But
which do you look forward to more? The writing, the reporting? How does that
work? The reporting. It's always more fun to ask people questions. Let me give you an example. This is not in the book. This is a piece I wrote not too long ago for Flamingo magazine, which was about Ross Allen, the snake man of Silver Springs. I stumbled across some information about Ross Allen and became just obsessed with him. You know, this guy who was a big star of Florida in the pre-Disney days. He ran this reptile show at Silver Springs from the 20s until, gosh, I guess the 60s. And, you know, thousands of people came to see him. he paid kids to bring him rattlesnakes so that he could milk them for his show and then sell the rattlesnake meat and sell the venom to the anti-venom makers. And you know, he was bitten by the snakes. He was a stand-in for Tarzan when they came here to make the Tarzan movies. If they had the ape man wrestling somebody underwater, that was where they called Ross Allen. Ross Allen was a champion swimmer. He dived in the water, you know, wrestled whatever they needed to wrestle. If you go to the Florida State Archives, they have a video where somebody visited the Ross Allen Reptile Institute and, you know, kind of talked about all the stuff that they did. And the centerpiece of the video is where he and his son take a 20-foot anaconda into Silver Springs and dump it in the water. And then his son Tom wrestles it. And when it looks like he's starting to get in trouble, then Ross Allen dives in and finishes off the snake, and then they put it back on the boat and take it back to where they have it in captivity. It's amazing. It's just amazing, you know, the stuff you know, is going on. So I love researching about Ross Allen. Trying to boil that all down into a story was painful. It was painful. But, you know, I got somebody to pay me for being nosy, so that's a good outcome. Yes, ma'am.
I wondered if you had any relationship with any of the Florida songwriters who write songs about weirdos in Florida and the animals and the destruction of our environment. There's just so many of them. We have a huge scene here. And my friend Grant Livingston from Miami,
Oh, yeah.
he writes about from the point of view that, like, he's got one of where he's the python.
Oh,
and
wow.
the life in the Everglades with all the feasting, you know, and
Yeah.
he also has one about that's from the point of view of the panther. It's really interesting.
That's great. No, I know his name. I don't know his work, but yeah, I am familiar with several folk artists here in Florida. Grant Peoples is one. Yes, and Rayford Stark obviously has the best name of all. There was a couple. What was their names? Friction Factory. I did a presentation in Fernandina Beach last month, and they came. Their shtick is that they write songs based on books they've read. So they will do a song about, you know, Moby Dick, and they'll do a song about what's the Bill Buford thing, A Walk in the Woods. And so for this particular presentation, they wrote and performed a song about Oh Florida, which it was pretty funny. It was pretty funny. I don't know if they're going to put it out on a, you know, on a CD or anything, but I think there's a YouTube video of it somewhere. So
you should look up the one about the python.
I will now. Thanks. I appreciate it. Yes.
I just want to know, probably subconsciously, I don't want to remember the name of the author, but it was very dystopian. It was about Florida. You're probably familiar with it. It's an author and his filmmaking
Is it
team.
Pat Frank's movie, or is it Pat Frank's book?
He traveled as a
Alas.
documentary filmmaker across Florida.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's very dark and very dystopian. I think it grows up, it's born in love, but it becomes very dark. So I was just wondering, you know, how you personally find the balance between, you know, celebrating what we have, the birds and lives, and mourning or dealing with what we're losing.
That's a good tough question, and I would, you know, if I was a politician, I would dunk it in a very professional manner. But since I'm not, you know, to me, when you get right down to it, there are a lot of things that are great about Florida that so far have not changed. One is we've got these world-class beaches that are consistently ranked in the top 10, if not number one. We've got a state park system that's won 4 national awards. And you know, ranges from the mermaids swimming at Weeki Wachee Springs to the depths of Devil's Mill Hopper here to Mariana Caverns, Falling Water State Park, where the water falls into a sinkhole and you never see the end. I mean, it's just amazing, unusual stuff. And so we've got this, and of course we've got the most interesting police log items in the world. You know, man arrested for punching a swan, you know, things like that. The interesting thing to me is the disconnect between what we as people value and what our politicians seem to value. And I fear that because of redistricting and the way they have manipulated the districts, that that disconnect will continue, where they tend to pay more attention to the big money interests, the polluters and so forth, who are destroying what's special about Florida, and not to those of us, you know, like the 75% of the people who voted in favor of Amendment 1, the land buying initiative, that they have consistently ignored since it passed in 2014. So if there's a way to fix that problem, I sure would love to hear it. And that's, you know, the thing that gives me some comfort is that every election year, they at least pay lip service to the idea of doing good things for Florida. And for instance, and it's usually when there's a crisis. We had the red tide outbreak when in 2018, when Governor Scott was running for U.S. Senate and Governor DeSantis was running for governor, and it became an issue in their campaigns. And people actually heckled Rick Scott until as Red Tide Rick until he actually abandoned a campaign appearance one time. Governor DeSantis promised he would do something about the toxic algae blooms and appointed a committee, and then the legislature ignored their recommendations. So, you know, I guess every election year is when you can kind of shake them by the lapels and say, listen, you got to do something. You know, and then in between, it just takes some tremendous effort to get them to, you know, stop destructive toll roads and things like that serve development interests, but not the actual people. I mean, you guys have probably heard about the Northern Turnpike extension that they're pushing now, and everybody I've talked to is against it. I mean, they think it's horrible. And from what I've been told, it's far from the first time they've tried to do that particular toll road, and it's been beaten back every time. And it just gets kind of wearying that they don't get the message of, you know, in the words of the 1845 flag that flew over Tallahassee, let us alone. You know, we want to be rural. We want to be this special place that we don't want to be Miami. Stop trying to shove that down our throat. So I guess the good thing is that we have things in Florida that we feel passionate about and we feel are worth fighting for when those interests come along and try and destroy them. And it's heartening to see that so many people have figured out that in Florida, the economy and the environment are tied together. If you screw up the environment, you're going to screw up the economy. So, so I sort of take heart in that as well. Yes.
Speaking of finding the balance between the joyful and the grieving,
Yes.
is there any chance you're going to revisit Manatee in fantasy?
That's actually my worst selling book, so I'm guessing the publisher probably doesn't want to. But I certainly could, because there's been an awful lot that happened since then. I write a weekly column for the Florida Phoenix now, and I did a column early in the Manatee die-off pointing out that, you know, in 2017, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said manatees were out of the woods and they could take them off the endangered species list and everything's fine, and now look where we're at. So, and then I've written a couple more since then about the die-off, and you know, a French magazine wants me to write about the die-off now. So there's certainly a lot more to write about. I don't know if it'll be in book form. Yes, man, I've never met before. This is my friend Jim Ross, by the way. Yeah.
Craig, are there stories like this in other states
No.
that have just gone
Of course not.
that have just gone untold because other states haven't had the number of newspapers and newspaper reporters that Florida has had? Doesn't have as many these days.
True.
But back in the day, is it a function of the number of people there to find and tell the stories?
That's a good point. There are some of the stories that are in this book you could find in other states. For instance, I'm sure there's a great story behind whoever is the longest serving inmate on death row in those states, in Texas or someplace like that. But other stories like the mermaid story, there's a piece in here about the nudist getting into a nudist resort, getting in a battle with the Postal Service. That is not a story you would see anywhere else. You know, Florida has more nudist resorts than any other state. And a lot of them are in Pasco County. And they are a continual source of good stories. Before one hurricane came through, my job at the Times was to call around and find out what places were accepting hurricane evacuees. And so I decided to call one of these nudist resorts, a place called Caliente, which should tell you a lot right there, and said, are you accepting any hurricane evacuees? And they said yes, and the good news is you don't have to pack your clothes. So I guess the answer is mixed. I guess there are a few stories that are you could tell somewhere else, but I don't think any other state would have a story like the one in here about the fastest gopher tortoise alive, where people driving through a scientific research station spotted a gopher tortoise with a radio antenna on its back, used a machete to cut the antenna off, and took the gopher tortoise to eat for dinner. It had a happy ending. I didn't hasten to tell you that one had a happy ending. So, but then just some stories are just unique to Florida, and yeah, we've been very lucky to have some excellent reporters doing a lot of those stories, but there are excellent reporters in other states as well. They just don't have the stories we got. Poor folks. Yes, ma'am.
Is the very first Florida man article actually known of, who's coined the Florida man?
No, it's not. I have actually sort of had a little sideline in trying to spot things like the Frederick Remington piece, where early visitors to Florida have identified and said, look at these wacky Florida people. Another one was, there was a visitor who came here in the 1830s and said it seemed to him that half the people in Florida were scalawags and rogues, and the other half were their penniless victims. So not much has changed,
I have
Yes, ma'am.
So I learned this actually recently, but there's a thing that on Google, you Google Florida man and your birth date.
Yes,
Did you ever do that one?
I did, and it was a very tragic story that I'm not going to repeat. So not all Florida man stories are funny stories. And then there's a piece in here about that. There's a piece in here called Mug Shots that talks about, some of them are definitely funny. Some of them, if you peel back that initial layer of comedy, there's actually tragedy underneath. And so, when you look at those mug shots, sometimes think to yourself, there, but for the grace of God, go I.
Sometimes you gotta laugh, keep from crying.
True, there's that too. I mean, in Florida, I went into some detail about the reasons why we produced a lot of these stories. We've undergone this wrenching demographic change where in 1940, we were the least populated southern state. This is pre-air conditioning, pre-bug spray, that makes sense. And then in 2014, we surpassed New York and we actually became the third most populous state. So we've got 22 million people living here now and 100 million visitors coming every year. And they're not evenly spread over the whole state. They're kind of crammed into that 30-mile wide swath along the coast or along I-4. And so you put that many people together in that short a length of time, coming from that many different backgrounds and languages and cultures, they're bound to start ramming into each other's cars and waving machetes at each other and arguing over whose dog pooped on whose lawn. And think about who those people are. We've got retired CIA agents who came here to train for the Bay of Pigs and fell in love with it and came back when they retired. We've got, carny people in Gibsonton who, they went out with their sideshow, the bearded lady and so forth, and now they're here in Florida. We've got uniformed Scientologists in Clearwater. We've got, professional python hunters, spam kings, monkey breeders, strip club moguls, and 29 electoral college votes every 4 years. I always have to mention, we generally rank 49th among the states in funding for mental health treatment. To which all I can say is thank God for Texas, Yes, ma'am.
Are you a generational native?
If you mean my folks been here a while, yes, ma'am, I am. My great uncle, and I talk about him in the last piece of the book, actually traced our family back to the first ones to come to Florida in 1850. Apparently looking for a good deal on waterfront condos, and we've been here ever since, and it's been quite a ride. Somebody asked me in one of my other appearances what was my most Florida man experience, and I told them about going to my grandmother's funeral in Jackson County, and the funeral home owner had a Lester Maddox pickaxe handle over his front door, and then on the ride to the cemetery, two of my cousins who were drunk and had mullets got into a fight in the limo. So I have had, and I was in there. I was like, guys, you know. So I know whereof I speak. Anybody else? Have I talked y'all a lot? Let me just tell you two things. One is I do a weekly podcast called Welcome to Florida. My co-host is a guy named Chad Scott, who's still fairly new to Florida. He's only been here 5 years. He lives in Fernandina Beach. And so he has lots of questions, and I try to give him the answers. The conceit of the show is that 900 new people move to Florida every week, and nobody tells them what they've gotten into. So we try and fill that gap. So we've interviewed python hunter, a gator wrangler, a nudist, a cockroach expert, shark biologist, interviewed Carl Hyacin. We talked to Clyde Butcher, the photographer. We talked to Betty Osceola, an element of the Miccosukee tribe, who still lives in a chickee and cooks outdoors. You know, we've talked about native wildflowers, horseshoe crabs. Our guest who's going to be on the show on Tuesday is an expert on William Bartram, because I see William Bartram featured here. He helps set up the Bartram paddling trail in Palatka. So it's a chance for us to kind of explore these topics, and also we have a lot of fun. The horseshoe crab one is crazy, just crazy. So so tune into that on whatever platform you like to listen to your podcast. I was nervous about podcasts until somebody explained to me it's basically just radio on the internet. So now I'm fine with it. The second thing is there are books for sale back there, and I'll be sitting over here ready to sign them if you want to come up and ask me for my signature, and I promise I will sign my real name this time. No more John the Bishop. So thanks very much.